entertainers and our sports figures and people like that getting involved in our cause. But you've already given 2 examples where they are actually getting involved, so it might be that they are getting more involved than we actually think they're getting involved.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a new generation. Now, I can't go down the roster of, which athletes are doing something and which aren't. Obviously, Colin Kaepernick has put his life on the line, his livelihood on the line. But there does seem to be a different sense of needing to be involved with someone like LeBron James. And Michael Jordan did a very different kind of model, but I think even he has started to make some contributions. But I think this new generation is, much more out there. And, but they are kind of a throwback to Jackie Robinson. Maybe it just runs in cycles, and I'm glad we're in this cycle where the younger athletes are, feeling that they can be outspoken. And, really, what are you going to do? They have to take control. LeBron starting that school, I think, is just really important.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And I want to get back to Madam C.J. Walker a little bit, but could you share a little bit about your namesake as well? Because one of the things that always fascinated me is that whole period of the Harlem Renaissance. It's when things were just really taking off. We had a lot of authors in the community, people like Baldwin, Langston Hughes, and things of that nature. And it seems like your namesake was very much in the middle of all of that. So I just wondered if you could share a little bit about that part of your family history as well, because that was a very vibrant part of what was happening, definitely there in the New York area, but it was happening, like I said before, all over the country.
But, I've definitely, A'Lelia Walker has always fascinated me. And I would say as a young person in high school, when I was really just beginning to be aware of Black history and do my research, she was the person I was more interested in than Madam Walker. It took me a little while to get mature enough to really understand who Madam Walker was and what she was about. But I loved learning about A'Lelia Walker because she knew people like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, and she had all the artists and musicians and actors and writers who came to her parties at her house on 136th Street and the mansion that her mother had built in Irvington, New York. So I was just fascinated by what she did, and that the Dark Tower was the salon where people like to hang out. What I'm doing now, as I am almost finished with a biography of her, is really trying to take her out of the caricature, out of the cliche of her, where people did used to say, well, Madam Walker made the money and her daughter spent the money. But it's so, nobody is that superficial and that two-dimensional. She helped with the early days of the business. But, when you are the child of someone who is larger than life and an original, a founding entrepreneur, it's very hard to do exactly what they did. You can't do exactly what they did. So you have to carve out your own path. And we see that, as all children should carve out their own path. She really loved music and loved the arts and had grown up in St. Louis when they were still very poor, but when ragtime was just being started in the 1890s, and she also loved opera. Black people were really into opera then. We don't really know that now. But she loved to promote music and promote art, and that was her skill. She was kind of an impresario, really. She knew how to throw a huge, fabulous party. She'd be the head of an events planning with the most fabulous events today.
And I can definitely relate to what you're talking about, being a person who comes in underneath somebody and having to kind of continue that path and try to create your own path as well while you're still honoring the path of those that came before you. Because like I said before, my grandmother built one of the first libraries here in the Raleigh-Durham area that was African-American centered. My granddad, her husband, was a biologist at Central, and the biology department is named after him. And then both my parents have been involved in radio stations, and mom's been involved in the nonprofit world. So I can relate to somebody having to try to live up to those standards. And then I've had friends that have had family members that were just as well known as they are. Like some of them have tried to become artists while their parents are artists. Some of them have tried to even do sports. Like I wouldn't say that we were friends or even close friends. I am an acquaintance of Doc Rivers, and I know that Austin was trying to follow behind him, even going to Duke and now still playing in the NBA. So I can definitely relate to folks trying to create their own path, but also honor the path that has been laid before them. And like I said, that's just on my dad's side, some of that history that I talked about, but Mom also has some people on her side as well that have had a lot of heritage and history, particularly in the rural area where they grew up at.
Yeah, I mean, and people do have to find their own path. You know, for me, people used to say to me, well, how come you aren't working in the family business? And I feel really fortunate that my parents really wanted me to follow my passion. My passion was writing. I wanted to be a journalist. And, for me it is, I guess it's sort of ironic that I did that. I worked in television news, as you mentioned, but I then began to tell Madam Walker's story, and there had not been a book written about her. So I was able to use those skills that I learned following my passion to now be able to tell her story. But I could do it on my own terms as opposed to feeling that I had to do it. I think you have to come to something in a way that you're comfortable and it is authentic for you.
And you talked about your TV background and working in TV news. Now, you were coming up at a time when and getting into the TV news, when the glass ceiling was still somewhat out there and everything, and there was always complaints that there were not enough of us in production, in green lighting capacities, and things of that nature. It seems that is changing to some degree, partially because of what you mentioned earlier, the advent of the Internet and other kinds of means that people can tell their stories without necessarily having to go through the normal channels of the networks and things of that nature. But at the same time, we also have in radio, which I'm very familiar with, not just because of this show, but some other radio shows that I've been involved with in the past and even currently, that, we've got radio that's basically controlled by 3 or 4 networks. So it's almost like to some degree we are changing, but to some degree we're not changing. So as a media person, what has been your assessment of where media is now and where it could be going? And do you see kind of those observations that I just made, or do you have others that you might want to add?
No, well, that is one of those things that's very frustrating and challenging right now, that the ownership of black radio stations that are programmed for African American audiences, that the ownership is really challenged at this point, and radio is really it's difficult because we used to own so many more radio stations. It is a disruption of this entire industry, but then you see these bright spots where, with Richelieu buying Essence, it's like now it's back with black ownership and really caring about the audience. But it's difficult because it's so expensive, and the laws have changed, the regulations have changed. With this current administration, we know that there's no interest in African Americans having any real ownership of anything. I will say that when I started a long time ago, in the mid 1970s, when I went to work at NBC, women had sued Newsweek and had sued NBC and ABC because young women were hired as secretaries and researchers, and they got stuck there, and young men were hired as desk assistants and associate producers, and they moved up the ranks to be producers. But after the lawsuit, it was clear that there was gender discrimination. So I was one of those people who was a recipient of those doors opening up for women. And there was a point during the 1980s when there were a number of African-American bureau chiefs for NBC and for the other networks. Now that with the disruption of the networks, there are very few bureaus, and a lot of those jobs are gone. But the doors opened up, but then it seems that, when the economy changed, when the business model changed, a lot of people were out of those jobs. So we're in a very challenging period of time. But I see some bright spots like the Undefeated at ESPN and what Kevin Merida is doing, what LeBron is doing with media. So we're in a best of times and a worst of times combination. Who's going to survive?
Yeah, but one of the things that I've noticed, it seems to have changed, and I've got several friends locally that are in the media, and some that have moved on to other networks, even in other states. But one of the things that does seem to have changed to some degree is I remember back I went to school in the 80s in terms of like my college education and everything, and even then, and even to some degree over the last 10 to 15 years, there was always these complaints about ageism, particularly for black women and particularly women that are producers, directors. But it seems that has changed to some degree, because I am seeing some of my friends that were reporters that are getting up there in age, I'll put it that way. They're not exactly what people would consider young people, and they're still able to maintain their work, whether that's on the desk, maybe less so there, but definitely still out in the field. But I've seen some ladies that are still in their 40s, even 50s and 60s that are still involved. So it seems like we are finding ways to get past some of that ageism, because I know that was a very serious issue at one point.
Right, probably because people are afraid of lawsuits, which they should be. But it is. I think that's very true that the old, for women especially, that the older they get. But I think local news, if that's what you're talking about, that there's a comfort level, and the stations and the advertisers would rather have a known quantity and somebody who's been around for a while. But I think that may be one factor, but there may be some other things as well.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's factors involved, suits and things of that nature. Like I mentioned on this show one time before, I was actually surprised at how ageism still plays a factor in fields that we don't even think about ageism necessarily. Because I remember my mother got to be a board trustee of a local bank, or a state bank here in North Carolina, and she did not have that job for a long time. I think she had it for like maybe about 4 or 5 years, because they had like an age cutoff. So I think that one thing, when she turned somewhere between 70 and 72, they were like, nope, I know we hired you at a later age, but we've got this age cutoff, so you can only serve for this minimal amount of time because of the age cutoff, which was probably established at a time when people weren't even living into like this. I mean, when now people are living into their 90s and even into the century mark.
Right. So I think that I think once, when the economy, the sort of the crash in 2008, even though that's been a decade ago, I think a lot of people who were in their 50s sort of never recovered from that and never really got back to the level of, jobs that they had. People. I'm talking about people in white collar jobs. And now everything is electronic. They can see your age, and a lot of people just never get a call back. I do have a few friends who are in their 50s and who are really struggling because they haven't been able to, recreate the income that they had before that big market turnaround.
Yeah, that's very true. We have seen that market turnaround and everything. Now, one thing that I remember reading about the house was that you actually got a chance to stay in the house for a while. So what was that like? Because this house seems like it was a very iconic house with all kinds of rich history that you were like literally living in. Like, some of us are not that fortunate that we get to live in a house.
Right. Well, I have visited. I've actually never lived there, but my mother, as a really little girl, did spend some time there. And I've never lived in the house, but I have visited, and it was owned for many years by Harold and Helena Doley, an African American couple from Louisiana. And they did a fabulous job of renovation, and it was a designer show house in 1998. So a new kitchen. So it's not the old kitchen, but they put the original tile roof is back on. They did a lot of upgrades, and so the house is now really restored. And the National Trust for Historic Preservation has done a really good job of making sure that it will be preserved into the future so that it won't be changed, it won't be knocked down. And I would just say, folks should keep paying attention to what is happening with the house. I think there are going to be some interesting things within the next 6 months or so, and perhaps open from time to time. It's not going to become a house museum, because that kind of, we talk about business models. The business model for the house museums is hard to do now because kids, school systems don't have money to send kids on field trips anymore. But there are some things that will be happening, so I urge folks to pay attention. And, this is a very interesting time. It's the 150th anniversary of Madam Walker's birth. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of her death. And this year is the 100th anniversary of the opening of Villa Lawaro. So we've got Villa Lawaro as a National Historic Landmark. In Indianapolis, the Madam Walker Legacy Center is a National Historic Landmark. It's undergoing a major renovation with money from the Lilly Endowment and in partnership with Indiana University, Purdue University. It will reopen in late 2019. My book on A'Lelia Walker will come out around the same time, and then the Netflix series is scheduled to come out Christmas 2019.